You ready? What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Fabrication 101. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We were back in the garage working on the back of my butt, my big ugly truck. We are going to be trying, well, maybe not trying, we're going to be working on these tubes that are going to attach to the rear bumper, try to finish it out and make it look pretty good. You can see that the, ooh, wasp just landed on my arm. Get out of here, wasp. You can see that I did go ahead and pull the top plate off, and I went ahead and added some dimples to it. The 3-inch dimple goes down. The other ones, these are 1.5 and 1 inch, come up just for maybe a little bit of traction on there. I did get the license plate lights. I did get the license plate lights put in there. I'm gonna have to pull them back out when I go to paint everything. And then my mounting brackets on the side, which are kind of hard to see in that edge and that light. You can see these mounting brackets up in here are tied in the way they should be. So the plan here is I'm going to have a tube that comes, a 2-inch round tube, probably going to come out pretty close to out here, come out at an angle and kind of wrap the corner just a little bit. I was thinking about cutting the corner of the fender off. I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm actually going to cut it and just bring the bumper around to here and then maybe cut the corner off at an angle. I've seen some trucks done like that, and I tend to like the way those look. So I think that's going to be my plan. My front bumper has where it comes around the corner is about maybe 4 or 5 inches tall. I don't think I'm going to go quite that big. I think I'm going to bring it down maybe just the 2-inch and then the 1.75 inches, so maybe about 3 inches or so. I guess it'll be closer to 4 by the time it's done, but I think that'll look pretty good, and then I'll cut the corner of that fender down. The bottom tube will come off right about here and then up at an angle and then kind of match the turn, and then I'll probably do some sheet in here with some dimple dies in it to kind of match the way the front bumper looks. Overall, it looks pretty good. You can see it's all welded and blended out. Most of this went pretty smoothly. Quite a bit of grinding. Again, that was the intention the whole time. I didn't do it just to hide ugly welds. You know, some of them I can't quite get to, like this whole weld in here is not going to get ground down or smooth or anything. I'm not going to bother trying to put body filler or any of that kind of stuff in there, so it'll just get painted over. So anyway, let's start working on some tubes. So the tubes on this bumper are going to be pretty straightforward and not too difficult. It's not going to be quite a 90-degree bend here, but some of the difficulties that go in with doing any kind of tube work is figuring out the dimensions. I prefer to work with the outside dimensions of the tube. And it's important that you pick one and work with that. Don't switch back and forth because you'll just get yourself mixed up. So what I'm going to do is kind of get an idea of the distance from the edge of the bumper to where I want the outside of the tube to sit here, and then the distance from there forward, and then I can get an idea of how that tube is going to be shaped. And then I'm kind of still old school. I don't have a fancy program to do this stuff. I still just draw things out either on the table or even on the floor. If you're working on your floor and it's a project that's taking you a lot of time, a simple thing to do if you're using, a lot of times I like to use like the tire crayons because they leave a nice clear mark, or even soapstone works really well. A good kind of a simple thing you can do if you're working on the floor of your shop or whatever is to take some clear spray paint, clear coat, If your project's going to be on the floor for a while, and paint over your lines so that you don't disappear them while you're halfway through your project. These pieces are going to be small enough. I'm just going to do them on my table. I have in the past, like on my Bronco roll cage, where I've laid out half of it, done half of it, and then I redrew the other half, just so I didn't have to, because I didn't have room to work on the floor for that one. But there's lots of different ways you can do these things. Like I said, the simplest thing is just to get some rough dimensions, and always make your pieces a little bit oversized, because then you can work them in from there. So it looks like I'm about 18 inches from the edge of the bumper out to the edge of the body. I may bring it out just a hair more, just so I have a little bit of corner protection if I'm out and I bang this into a tree or something. So we'll start by getting dimensions and transferring them onto the table, and then we'll work from there. So my distance from the edge of the bumper to the side of the bed is about 18 inches. So what I'm going to do, the way I do this is I'm going to lay out 18 inches or so here, and then the distance from the edge of the bed out to the edge of the bumper where I want to be is about 4.5 inches. So the simplest thing for me to do is just to come over here and mark out my 4.5. So my tube will come kind of like this along here, and then it'll bend up this way. So if you're looking at the rest of this tube, it's going to go kind of like this, and it'll bend out this way just a little bit, and that should give me my dimension. So the way this works is you need to figure out your bend radius here. There's a couple ways to do this. So this piece of dirty, nasty cardboard is actually, it matches my 2-inch die. It has a 6.5 inch radius. These notes here are for my 1 3/4 die, so they don't quite apply as much. So basically the simple thing here is you just take this and you trace it, and that gives you your bend radius so that you know you're going to be able to make your turn. This looks like it's going to work pretty well, so we're going to try to get a rough idea how much material we need here. I'm going to leave a couple inches there, and I like to go all the way to there, to the edge, and then I'll add a little bit. So we're going to start with a 30-inch piece of 2-inch 120 wall for this first tube. One thing you always want to get into when you're working with tubing and bending tube is you want to get your clean your material off. You want to get any kind of dust, metal dust, any shavings, grinding dust, any of that kind of stuff off of the tube, because what happens is it will get embedded into the dies in your tubing bender, and eventually it'll start to scratch the tube when you bend. I use brake cleaner, and I know somebody's going to freak out and tell me that you're not supposed to use brake cleaner around welding. This is non-chlorinated brake cleaner. The chlorinated is the ones you don't want to use. If you're not familiar with that, chlorine gas, the chlorine, when exposed to the UV light from the welding arc, breaks down and becomes what's called phosgene gas. I talk about this all the time with my students. It kind of gives you this weird smell. A lot of people say it smells like fresh cut grass or something like that. You can use non-chlorinated brake cleaner, or you can use acetone or any other kind of solvent, but it's just a good idea to get your tube clean. Make sure there's no grit or debris or material on there. So we're gonna get this tube bent. I use this thing here. It's just 2 pieces of 1 1/8 inch flat strap that I put a bolt through. I've used this for years, and I use this to kind of get a rough idea of my angle. So what I'll do is I'll set this on my table, match up the angle of my bend, and so this gives me a pretty good starting point for how far I want to bend. I always go till this matches on release. So once it matches under pressure, I'll go 2 or 3 more degrees, let it off, and then I'll see where I stand as far as my bend. So when I drew this, I said this is where was going to be where I'm going to start my bend. What I'm going to do is a little different. I'm actually going to line up the end of my tube with the back of my tubing bender here, and that's just going to be where my starting point is. I think it's still going to leave me with enough material to work with, hopefully. So we'll go ahead and get that locked up in there, get the bender hooked up, and go ahead and bend this tube, figure out what angle this needs to be to. All right, so another thing here is this is HREW tube. So it means there's a seam here. HREW stands for hot rolled electric welded. This is not ideal tubing for roll cages, but since the bumper is not structural, this is a little bit cheaper than a DOM tube. I'll be honest with you guys, in the past, a long time ago when I was first doing this stuff, there were still a lot of cages that were built out of HREW. And my opinion is if you're going on a trail rig, you're going slow and just kind of crawling around, this is probably going to be just fine as long as it's built right. One of the important things I always stress when you're bending this kind of tube is you always try to put the seam on the inside of your bend, because as the tube bends, the outside of the bend is going to get stretched, and if there's anywhere that's going to be a weak point in this tube, it's going to be the seam. So ideally, if you're building roll cages for things that are going to go fast, or maybe rolled really hard, then you would want to be looking at DOM or even chromoly tubes. So let's go ahead and get this put in the bender. If you're new and you haven't seen the previous ones where I've talked about this bender, this is a JD Squared Model 4. I have it set up, it is a hydraulic bender. I have it set up as air over hydraulic. I like the air over hydraulic a lot better than electric over hydraulic. I feel that the air over is slower, and I'll give you that. Some people are in such a big hurry that makes a big difference to them. The air over, to me, has a lot more control. I could easily go like a half a degree if I feel like I need to. It's harder. You can actually go smaller bends than this thing will measure, or smaller increments, I guess I would say. The other benefit is, in my experience and from the numbers, the air over hydraulic actually puts out a little bit more pressure than the electric over hydraulic. And you can't really see this, but this here is the center pin. This is not the original center pin for this bender. The original 1-inch center pin I bent bending some 2-inch 3/16 wall tubing in this bender. It did the bends. I won't ever do them again because it did bend that pin, and during the bend you could actually watch this whole plate flex. So this is now a 1-inch grade 8 bolt that sits in here. I've never had any issues since then, but I haven't really bent anything crazy since then. So we'll go ahead and get this tube bent. We've got our angle figured out here. So basically I just run this around and then I set this on the top to try and get an idea where the bend needs to be. All right, so we've got it locked in there. And just to get pressure on the tube, we're at what, 8-9 degrees here already. So whatever you're trying to bend to, if you say you want to go to exactly 90, you'd have to take that into consideration, and then whatever the spring back is, which usually it's a couple of degrees. I kind of like to keep it simple and not have to think too hard. So we're going to go ahead and get this bent. All right, so there we're kind of pretty close to matching my bend on my little tool here. You can see where I talk about the control of this thing. If I just put a little tiny bit of pressure on it, you can see it's just barely creeping. So I want to go a couple more degrees. So right now I'm at 89. So let's go to 90. Let's see, that's 90. That's 90. So let's go ahead and release that and see where we sit. So we took all the pressure off of it. And it looks like 90 degrees is going to work. So 90 degrees on here is not a 90 degree bend. So let's go ahead and get this thing out of here. We'll check it on the table. So you can see one thing I always do is try to make a note. I used to write all this stuff down in a notebook, but a lot of these pieces that I do are one-time bends or one-time projects, not something I'm going to duplicate again. So I don't really keep track of all that stuff anymore. So if I lay this on the table, and I get it pretty well lined up. You can see this edge lines up nicely with the table. This lines up pretty well with my line on the table. So it looks pretty good. So the true test is to take it over and put on the truck, which it's not gonna fit because it's still way too big, but at least we can get an idea of how things are gonna fit on here. I may have to cut around the corner just a little bit further than I was intending to. And so far, I'm kind of liking the way that's looking. So if I put this piece up there where I want it to go, kind of hold this roughly, and take a measurement from the edge of the bed to the outside of my tube, it gives me a pretty good idea how much I need to cut off of that end of my tube. And I'm also going to try and get that start working on getting that angle a little bit closer to where I want it as I start cutting it. So I got to cut out about 5 inches. I think my first cut I'll probably do 4.5-ish because I want to kind of work my way into it. That gives me time to get this angle really nicely so I have a nice good weld seam there. So if I go right about there, you can see, I don't know if you guys can see it, but this edge, there's a huge gap, but that's because this end of the tube is not in where it's supposed to be. So now it comes kind of the cut and move a little bit game to try and get it in there kind of how you want it. So what I want to do is leave this there as best I can and kind of start marking this to start cutting this so it kind of works its way in around the corner. So if I mark it right there, I'm gonna have to cut it off a little shorter. So let's go ahead and get it started. All right, let's see how that fits. So if I put this back right about there, you can see it still doesn't quite fit in there. I got to trim some more off. There's another thing I could try here, and I can stick this piece in and then kind of get an idea there. So this will give me an idea how much I actually need to cut off. And we're sticking out a little bit here because it doesn't quite fit in the body line. So I'm going to go ahead and cut like another inch off and kind of slowly work my way into it. It might take up to 2 inches, but we're going to go a little bit at a time. So this is not a place where you can rush things again. All right, so we're pretty dang close. Close enough that I think it's time to do some kind of final fit up with the hand grinder. That's still the original cut on that end. This end I did have to make a couple more cuts on. I think it's gonna have to come out just a little bit from the body. I don't want it touching, even though I'm gonna trim it off. So we'll get that kind of fine-tuned a little bit here. Maybe even get it tacked into place. First tube is in, looks pretty good. Looks like it might be hanging down a little low on the outside. It's important when you're doing this kind of stuff, especially on a vehicle that's been around for a while. This truck's, Jesus, almost 20 years old now. 19 years because it's a 2001. Like I said, it's important to kind of look around, get as many different angles and perspectives as you can, looks at it, because you know, as much as I try to get it centered in there, it may not be centered. The bed might be moved. I do know, like on the front of this thing, when I was building the front bumper, I found out that it had been in a front end collision at some point in its life before I had it. And the front end is not straight, not square. So sometimes you got to make it so it looks right. And kind of ignore getting all the measurements exactly the same, because sometimes when they're tweaked a little bit, it's going to be kind of difficult. If you make it measured out perfect and symmetrical, it may not look right. So your eyes can kind of trick things into looking good. So I think eventually I'll probably end up putting like a filler plate here to kind of close up that gap. Maybe not, I don't know. We'll see how it looks once it's all done. I'm going to do another tube from down here, like I said, 1.75 inches, that comes up and then matches the bend around. The nice thing is the 1.75 inch die is the same bend radius, so they should match up fairly close. So the second tube went pretty smoothly, pretty easy, because it's basically it actually ended up being almost exactly the same as this tube, even though this is 1.75 inches and this is 2 inch. The bend dimension was the same. The way I bent it was the same, pretty simple. This notch here is a little bit more difficult because it is kind of a compound angle. Because not only do I have the tube going backwards, it's going up at the same time. So getting that in was a little bit more tricky. I think I'm going to go ahead and cut a copa tube here so I have like a 1/2 inch space between the tubes and make that fit up. I think it's going to look good. So far I'm super pleased, liking the way that's coming out. I think it'll look pretty good when it's all said and done. Not a lot of room in here for some dimples. But I don't think that's that big of a deal, but I still think it'll look really good when it's done. So I want to make a short little 1/2 inch notched piece here, and there's a couple different ways to do this. I'm going to show you guys the way I like to do it that doesn't, I don't think, wastes a lot of tube. Start by making like a reference line down the tube, and that's so that you can make sure that they're rotated the same direction each notch that you have to do. I have my 2-inch hole side, my notcher right now, so we'll go ahead and start with that one because one side is a 2-inch and the other side is going to be an 1 3/4. So we'll get this piece put in there. We'll go ahead and make our first notch real quick. So the reason I like doing this method is because it allows me to use up some of these scraps of tubing that I have. I know I've seen and I've done it where basically you end up running the hole saw all the way through the tube, through a chunk of tube, which works. I don't know, I like this better. So we're gonna go ahead and run this done. Now we'll go ahead and clean up the rough edge real quick. So it's notched pretty good. We'll go ahead and clean that up and then I'll show you the next step. All right, so we got it cleaned up. Now what we need to do is we need to measure, because I want a 1/2 inch piece, we want to measure a 1/2 inch from the edge of our saddle, the edge of our cope, down and put a mark. That gives me my height dimension. That's what this reference line is kind of nice for, although what it's really important for is the next steps. So we've got that marked. Then what we do is we take another scrap piece of tubing, in this case, and it's a little bit bigger, and so what we want to do is have this piece slide in so that we can have a way to hold this in the tubing notcher. And then what we do is we put a little tack welds on the sides, and we can put them pretty close. What I like to do is put the tack welds kind of on the same side as the saddle. That way if I gouge them a little bit, I can go ahead and they'll disappear when I go ahead and weld it. So we'll go ahead and get this piece tacked together and then we'll put it in the notcher. I got to change the hole saw out, but then we'll get the other side notched. Should be pretty straightforward. You can slide this in, get this lined up. And part of the reason for my reference line mark, like I said, is so I can get this thing clocked in there the way it needs to be, so that we get our notch where we want it to be. And then once we've got it notched, then we just flip it around and cut the tack welds and pop the tube out. So there we go. Just gotta grind down that little tack weld just a little bit, but there we have basically a 1/2 inch notch for 2-inch and 1 3/4 on the top. So a little 1/2 inch spacer. So we can go ahead and now we can tack our spacer up in here. So as soon as I can figure out which side is the 2-inch and which side is the 1 3/4. There's my 2-inch side. So what I want to do is line it up with the edge of the tube there, and then I'm going to make some tacks. Now, one of the things about this is I always try to put the tacks where I can cut them out later if I need to. If I were to put them in here, they'd be really hard to get out. So I'm just going to put them on the outside here for now. I think it'll be okay. So let's go ahead and get that tacked up in there. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and see how this other tube fits. Probably not ready to tack this in just yet, but looks like I need to do a little bit more grinding on that end. But it's pretty close. Having that tube in there, that spacer, actually helps get things lined up a little bit better. Makes it a little easier to make sure everything's the same. So I got a little bit of grinding to do on this end. But other than that, I'm pretty pleased with the way that's looking. All right, so it fits up in there pretty good. I think we're gonna go ahead and get it tacked up in there, and then see how things look. I'm trying to kind of make the front edge of this symmetrical from both sides. So I'm trying to have the same distance out, as well as matching the distance from the bottom edge, and keep this side lined up. Looks like we're pretty good. It'd be nice if I hadn't set my welder so far away. All right, looks pretty good. I'm pretty pleased so far. All right, so there's one side, pretty, well, just tacked together, not anywhere near done, but looks pretty good. I'm pretty pleased with it looks. Kind of step back and get a view from the back. I'm liking that a lot. I got to look really good with some material in here to kind of fill in that space. I think I'll probably go ahead and do a plate up here because that'll add a lot of strength to this corner. But other than that, liking the way that looks. Now the hard part really is going to be duplicating them on that side, or actually mirroring them, not duplicating them, because I don't want to make the same piece. I've done that before, especially on the front bumper on this thing. I spent a bunch of time getting one side made, then started making the next side and realized I was making a duplicate and not a mirror image. So far so good. So we'll go ahead and get the other side knocked out. I did go ahead and bend my other 2-inch piece before I did the bottom, or my 1 3/4 down there. So we'll get that piece cut, get it tacked, and then see if we can do our other 1 3/4 piece. All right, what do you guys think? I got both sides tacked in place. They're not fully welded by any means. Pretty pleased. I'm liking the way it's looking. I said now, before we start welding, I am gonna put a plate up here. That will probably go ahead and make that at an 1/8 inch, just like the rest of the bumper, because it'll add quite a bit of strength to this corner, so that if ever got hit or something like that. And then I'm probably gonna go ahead and do a plate here with some dimple dies in it, but that will probably be done out of some 16 gauge material, because there's no reason to add any more weight to this thing than I already have. It's already going to be pretty heavy, especially once I throw a winch in there. Looking pretty good though. Liking the way it's coming out. All right, you guys, so this video is getting pretty long as it is, and there's still quite a bit of detail I want to go into when we're finishing up the rest of this bumper. So I'm going to split it into 2 videos. We'll pick up the rest of the bumper build next time on Fabrication 101. Do me a favor, like this video, comment, share, subscribe if you haven't already. Help me grow this channel, and we will see you guys on the next episode of Fabrication 101. Again, in the meantime, do me a favor, do yourself a favor, and go build something.